Greetings from the Santander Department of Colombia. I haven't been able to post a video in a while because I've been dealing with some illness, but also my travel has made it impossible to find time and internet access in order to make this next video. Sorry for any extra noise. There are some people doing some work behind the camera here, so it may be a bit loud. One of the most important things that needs to be talked about is the African influence on Western music. Since it's something that I'm going to be referring to a lot in future videos, I thought it would be a good idea to just make a brief overview of the African origins to most Western, modern, and even folkloric styles of music. One of the sad realities of modern day Western music is that it is a direct result of the transatlantic slave trade, which brought more than 17 million African slaves to the Americas. And this number does not include the many more that died in transit and also died in wars and raids related to the slave trade. Most of us probably think of the Deep South in America when we think of the slave trade, but the reality is only about 10% of African slaves came to the Americas. Another 80% of African slaves went to Brazil and the Spanish colonies. If we examine the African influence on Western culture, we can see two distinct trends. We can see what I would call the Afro-American trend and also what I would call the Afro-Latin trend. In the United States, you do see a strong influence on the culture from the African population, but the direct link back to the continent of Africa is blurred very quickly. However, in Latin countries such as Colombia, Cuba, Peru, and Brazil, you see a consistently strong link back to the continent of Africa. There's actually a very simple reason for this. In the United States, slave owners relied on the repopulation of the slaves to keep their numbers up. As a result, after the first generation of slaves, the influence of the American slave owners was very strong over the culture of the African slaves. However, in Latin America, the French, Spanish, and Portuguese relied heavily on the consistent importation of slaves to keep their numbers up. The small island of Haiti saw over 8,000 slaves per year brought in for nearly a century. As a result, the majority of the slaves were still first-generation Africans. This also led to some differences in how slaves were treated. In Latin America, because of the constant importation of slaves, the slave numbers severely outnumbered the number of Europeans. As a result, the slave owners had more leniency towards the culture of the Africans. Some of the largest groups of people deported from Africa were the Yoruba, Akan, Iwi, and Mandinka. Today, it is incredibly difficult to properly identify the cultural and musical practices of 15th and 19th century Africa, as their ancient culture was practically destroyed by the slave trade and also by conquests of their continent. However, there is a lot that we can learn from the remnants that exist today, as well as the new forms of culture and music. One of the most musically significant things brought to the Americas by the Africans is the concept of the cross rhythm, a coin termed in the late 20th century. My definition doesn't do it justice, but to put it simply, it's another way to describe the 6/4 polyrhythm that exists in most African styles of music. One of my favorite things about African music is the communal aspect of it. In contrast to the development of European music, African music was a celebration of the community and required the participation of not just the performers but also everyone in attendance. Today we could see remnants of this in the form of call and response, and in Latin music, call and response takes the form of the coro and pregón. African music is structured differently than traditional European music. Generally speaking, time is marked by groups of pulses which are organized in beats every 3, 4, 6, 8, or 12 pulses. These are not accented as downbeats are in European music, but instead they serve as markers for the passage of time. The actual instrumental parts and melodies then usually consist of cycles, which are repeating patterns of 8, 16, or 24 beats. These cycles are usually syncopated patterns that repeat throughout the entire piece. In West Africa, different patterns interlock to create some of the most complex polyrhythms in the world. These polyrhythms are usually held together by a repeating ostinato line, or what is known as a guide pattern. This pattern is normally played on sticks, bells, or a side of a drum. To hear an example of the influence of this concept on Western music, you can listen to the wah-wah pattern of the music of Guaguancó of Cuba. These repeated patterns create what could be best described as a rhythmic trance. The complexity of the rhythm in the music is enough to retain the attention of the listener, but the repetition creates an environment which encourages more interaction and creativity from the dancers and musicians. One of the most common guide patterns existing in African music is this pattern. It can be felt in both duple and also in triple. It has many different names, but in Western society is most commonly referred to as the Abequa pattern. In Africa, this is the bell pattern for the Iwe's akpese, and is also the root to almost all the music belonging to the Yoruba people. If we listen to the duple pulse, we can hear how both Cuban clave patterns could have been born through this. And if we listen to the triple pulse, we can hear what is the bell pattern in what we now call Afro-Cuban 6/8. This is just a brief introduction to a concept that is actually quite huge. In future videos, I will talk more about specific styles of music from the continent of Africa and how they influenced Western culture. In my next video, I'm going to introduce you to the folkloric origins of the cumbia and teach you how to play the traditional rhythms. Walking down a mountain and trying to film and look in the camera at the same time is really hard. But you guys gotta come here. This place is amazing.